This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Recently, a new speed painting technique has been emerging from the depths of the internet. SLAPCHOP. Invented by Rob the Honest Wargamer, it is a simple technique to help you get miniatures painted and on the table fast without the aid of an airbrush. In this video, I'd like to analyze this style of speed painting, find out if it works as well as everyone says it does, and see if we can discover some improvements or perhaps alternate methods for speed painting along the way. Prime your miniature in black, dry brush it in gray, followed by a lighter dry brush in white, and once you've established your values, apply transparent paints like contrast, speed paints, or inks on top of that, and that's it. You're done. And if this seems familiar to you, it should. This painting style is called grisaille, or in terms you might be more familiar with, underpainting and glazing. Underpainting and glazing is what I would say is my default painting style, and it's the subject of many videos on this channel, including my first 2 videos posted over 3 years ago now. Happy birthday to this channel. The main difference between my technique and Rob's technique is that I tend to use an airbrush and a heck of a lot of glaze medium, while Honest Wargamer Rob uses dry brushing and contrast paints. And to be quite honest, I think that is the appeal of SLAPCHOP. There's no airbrush involved, no complicated glazing mixtures, it's just quick and dirty speed painting. A way to get things on the table fast without the aid of an airbrush. But enough with the theory, let's try some experiments. I started out by copying Rob's method as closely as possible, priming a model in black, and then using my largest, softest dry brush to apply some gray dry brushing to the model. I then used a smaller dry brush to dry brush some gray into those hard to reach places, and I then used a white paint to dry brush some white carefully and softly over top of that. My total time spent on this was about 10 minutes including the priming step, but I'm sure that if I was more practiced at dry brushing or if I was doing these in a large batch, I could have done this even faster. The next step is to slap on some transparent paints, and for this I used quite a large brush, trying to paint a bit faster than I usually would, and I mostly used contrast paints here along with some of my favorite pink fluorescent ink. I applied the paints as I usually would over a ZENITHAL highlight, going as fast as I could without losing accuracy, and overall this took me about 15 minutes to complete. So 25 minutes total, including the priming and the dry brushing. After waiting for the model to dry, this was the results. And I feel like this is not bad by any means for 25 minutes of work, especially considering you don't need an airbrush to achieve this. The appeal here is that pretty much anyone can do this, there's very little skill involved, and if you were really committed to it, you could probably knock out an entire army like this in a single weekend. However, I do feel like the highlights and midtones are a bit too dark for my liking. It's a great starting point for future highlighting and layering, but honestly, the SLAPCHOP method didn't really work out of the box as well as I expected it to. Perhaps I should have gone in heavier with the dry brushing or lighter with the contrast paints. In any case, this is a great starting point to make some improvements. But before we go any further, you might be wondering, how did I know which colors to use for these models? There are just so many contrast paints and AP speed paints to pick from, and it can be hard to know which one does what and which ones would make a good color scheme together. Well, I'm glad you asked, because I've set up a webpage for you over at howlcorp.com/colors, where you can compare and contrast every single Citadel contrast paint and every single AP speed paint next to similar colors so that you know exactly the paint that you need before applying it. And I have to say, it was extremely easy to put this page together as well as to continue updating it using this video's sponsor, Squarespace. For over a decade now, Squarespace has been my go-to solution for creating websites, whether you want to make a blog, a store, or a comparison page of every contrast and speed paint using serif on skinks. I'm honestly not the greatest with technology or computers, and I have no idea how to code, so I really appreciate that Squarespace has designed a system that works just like any plastic model kit. You just pick a template that looks good to you, pick whatever pages you might want to add to your site, and everything clicks together and resizes itself automatically in a really satisfying way. No coding or technical knowledge required. So if you'd like to build your own website for less than the cost of a monthly Netflix subscription, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/DanaHowell for 10% off your first order of a website or domain. So after my first attempt, I figured there was a lot of different ways I could improve on what I already did, so I set up a few different test subjects. Test subject number 2 was a model using my standard style of underpainting. This style is tried and true, and I've been using it for years now. And while the goal of this video is to improve on the SLAPCHOP method without using an airbrush, I thought it would be a good idea to do at least a single model using my typical underpainting method to see what a difference it makes so that we can then apply those lessons to the SLAPCHOP style. So for those of you who aren't aware or you want a refresher, here is my typical underpainting style. We start with a ZENITHAL prime, and that means a prime in black, followed up by a spray from above with a midtone of your choice. Sometimes I use purple, blue, or red for this, depending on the model and the colors we're using, but today we're just going to stick with the standard gray midtone, and then we're going to finish up with a lighter spray of white primer directly from above. After this, I like to shade in the recesses of the model with a dark wash, and once that's dry, I like to dry brush the entire model in white. The total time spent on this was about 4 minutes airbrushing, 3 minutes applying the wash, and 3 minutes dry brushing. So about the same amount of time as it took me to do the underpainting using the SLAPCHOP style. I then spent about 15 minutes applying contrast paints on top of that, and here was the result. As you can see, overall we're getting some brighter midtones and highlights, and just a higher contrast effect overall compared to the SLAPCHOP version. So if you do own an airbrush, I feel like I can say with confidence that doing it this way is a little bit better than the SLAPCHOP way, at least in my experience. However, that is not the point of this video. The point of this video is to see if we can improve upon the SLAPCHOP style without relying on an airbrush. So let's see what lessons we can take from my standard style of ZENITHAL and apply it to the SLAPCHOP method without using an airbrush. So after this, I prepared 4 different test models. For test model number 3, I tried a gray prime followed by a dark wash in just the recesses and a white dry brush on top of that once it was dry. For test model number 4, I tried a white primer followed by a dark wash in just the recesses, and then finishing up once the wash was dry with a white dry brush. For test model number 5, I tried the same SLAPCHOP method as before, so a black prime, but I just spent a little bit more time on the dry brushing and tried to get that undercoat a little bit brighter. And finally, test model number 6 is just a plain white model, just because I want to see what the brightest possible version of this looks like without any shading or dry brushing or anything. You can see I also did another model in my standard airbrush style here just so that I could do a shot like this, where you can see all the different styles of underpainting lined up next to each other and their positives and negatives. After this, I spent about the same amount of time on each model applying contrast paints and inks the way I usually would. As I went, I discovered that thinner paints work better for this style, and in general, I found applying the contrast paints in one thin coat rather than one thick coat like it's recommended to use them resulted in a better looking model for this style. So after applying all the contrast paints to our underpainting, I came to some interesting conclusions. Basically, none of these tests are what I would call the best one or the winner. And I think each of these methods could be useful depending on what results you're trying to get. Let's go through them one by one. First of all, sadly, I found that none of these test models really measured up to that original airbrush version that is my standard style. Some of them came very close, but if you do own an airbrush, according to my results, I think this is still the best way to go about it. However, if like most people you don't own an airbrush, you still have some solid options. And personally, I think my favorite out of all of these is the white primer plus dark wash and white dry brush. From what I could find, it gets you the closest you can get to the airbrush result, with the only real sacrifices you're making being slightly lighter midtones and not quite as dark shadows. So this can be a good option if you don't own an airbrush but you want to get close to that vibrant style. However, if you're painting an army you want to look a little bit grungy and have those really dark shadows, or if you're planning on adding some highlights and layering to these models after, I think the standard SLAPCHOP could actually be your best choice, especially if you spend a little bit more time on the dry brushing portion and you use thinner paint application like in my second attempt, which I am happy to report turned out a lot better than my first SLAPCHOP attempt. Meanwhile, the gray primer plus wash and dry brush, which is the one I was honestly kind of expecting to look the best, really isn't a massive improvement either, with the only real positive to this one being a slightly less chalky undercoat, because you can skip the gray dry brushing step and you only have to do a single dry brushing step. But overall, I think the gray undercoat is the loser of the batch if I was to pick a loser. Finally, let's talk about the plain white undercoat, no washes, no dry brushes, or anything. This one still looks really good in my opinion, but in most cases it doesn't really compare to our other few options. However, it is worth noting that it is still the fastest and the brightest. So I do feel that contrast or speed paints over a plain white undercoat does have its use cases. For example, if you were painting an army with mostly bright white armor tones, or if you were trying to get an army done in record speed. I don't know if someone was going to make a video like that, but if someone was going to make a video like that in the future, I think a plain white undercoat would do just fine. So regardless of which underpainting style you choose, SLAPCHOP, ZENITHAL, or somewhere in between, I think perhaps the best way to take these models from just okay on the tabletop to really great is to add some further highlights beyond the initial speed paint. And there are two main ways I like to do this. Number one, you could go with a high opacity paint like these So Flat paints that I reviewed recently, and do some standard layering from dark to light. This is a great option and I think might be my go-to method when I have a little bit more time and I want to get a little bit more invested in the models. However, if you want something a little bit quicker that's going to bring out some of those highlights in your model, I could recommend pulling out your pale sand, or actually I found Brain Matter Beige from Army Painter is a pretty good one to use for this as well, and just do some edge highlighting on pretty much everything with pale sand. And then use the thinned down versions of the original transparent paints to blend these down into the model. And if you'd like to do this sort of thing with Army Painter speed paints and you're concerned about reactivation, you can either varnish your models first before adding those extra highlights, or you can check out my video on how I fixed speed paints for my method of how I would add extra layers of highlights to a speed painted model. Whatever method you choose to use, I hope this was a useful video to you. I hope you'll try out some of these techniques for yourself, or maybe go and check out Rob's original video on SLAPCHOP if you feel like I didn't do the SLAPCHOP method justice, or you should just go check out his video anyway. I provided a link down in the description. Please let me know down in the comments which underpainting style that you liked best, and let me know if you have any good ways that you think I could improve my SLAPCHOP method. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Thank you to all of my lovely patrons for supporting the channel. It really means a lot to me. And I will see you in the next video. By the way, this was my Orktober video. I totally forgot to mention that. And I managed to paint up more orcs and goblins this Orktober than any previous one. So, happy Orktober, everyone.